Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tadina Simpson, class of 2005, and I have the privilege of serving as the current co-chair for Duke Black Alumni alongside Sanders Adu, class of 94. For those who do not know, Duke Black Alumni, or DBA, represents over 10,000 Black alumni from the undergraduate, graduate, and professional schools. Our alumni live all around the world, and one of the integral pieces of our mission is to create engaging programs for the benefit of our alumni. That is why we have created this particular lecture series. Given what has transpired in the past few months with the killings of Black people across the country by police officers and other individuals, it became very apparent that there is no better time than now to shed some light on and discuss the issues that impact Black lives. So thank you for joining us and participating in today's lecture. On behalf of DBA, I also want to say thanks to AAA for supporting us and allowing us the opportunity to deliver this lecture to the entire Duke alumni community. Finally, a huge thank you to the esteemed faculty members from Duke's Department of African and African American Studies for taking the time to speak with all of us tonight. Given the rich conversation that I know we will have, I imagine that there will be a number of questions for tonight's speakers. However, we will reserve those Q&A for the end of the program, which will be moderated by Harry Jones, our current DBA co-chair-elect, and the man with the vision for this lecture series. With that said, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Harry Jones.
Thank you so much, Dina. I would also like to thank all the Duke alumni that are tuning into tonight's lecture, particularly on the heels of a holiday weekend. It means a great deal to us. For many, Durham is a second home. The Duke community is family, and Duke's faculty are the thought leaders that have provided the foundation for which we contextualize our surroundings. It's from this perspective that we created tonight's event, which is the first in a series of lectures where we will explore all aspects of Black life in America. Whether you are able to watch one lecture or all parts of our series, we hope to broaden your view on various issues facing Black Americans. I would now like to turn it over to our distinguished professors, my good friend and the chair of the AAAS department, Professor Mark Anthony Neal, and the associate chair of the history department, Professor Adriane Lentz-Smith, as we dive deep into race in America. Thank you.
Hey, Professor.
Hey, Dr. Neal, how are you doing?
I'm good.
I guess we'll jump in. This is the second conversation we've had since COVID sent us home on camera. And we've appeared together on local news. You've appeared on national news. And I think you've heard me say in different settings that I'm resistant and in some levels have been frustrated by this idea, maybe too pessimistic to admit hope, right? That this is a different moment, that something has changed or that this really is a meaningful moment. But since the last time we talked, Mississippi took down its flag, Alabama football came out, in support of Black lives, and NASCAR decided that the Confederate flag was not welcome. And so all of a sudden I've gone from being like, no, to being like, what? And I'm wondering where you are, what you think about what's going on.
And let's not forget, our own Coach K recorded a Black Lives Matter message.
This is not a political issue. This is a human rights issue, he said.
So this is the thing, and you're a historian, so you can appreciate this. We're talking about dismantling hundreds of years of anti-Black violence, anti-Black sentiment, white supremacy, and that can't happen in 3.5 weeks. And when we think about some of these Confederate flags and these statues, these monuments, right, and this is not something that's unique to this moment, this has been an energy that we've been looking at for the last 4 or 5 years. The NAACP has been going after Confederate flags, for 2 decades. But when you consider those monuments, when you consider NASCAR, all the businesses, Aunt Jemima, Rastus, who I just found out was the name of the cream of wheat guy, Uncle Ben, all these folks, symbols that are disappearing, it's really low-hanging fruit. And it's low-hanging fruit that's importantly connected to commercial concerns. right? You know, NASCAR doesn't want to get dragged on social media. The University of Alabama
Here's what I found.
is concerned about the fact that they want to make sure they can continue to recruit the fastest and the strongest Black athletes from around the country, you know, who might give a second thought, you know, to going to the University of Alabama to play football, you know, if the University of Alabama is not on the right side of history. You know, so, you know, on the one hand, there's some excitement and there's hope. And I like to remind people, you know, hope is a passive engagement, right? You know, as I've been joking with folks, you know, I've been hoping, right, to make sure that I don't die of hypertension, right? But if I'm not walking to put them 13,000 steps in a day, you know, that's not happening. And so I think we have to be cautious with this moment and not get so caught up in the excitement of the movement that we've seen to forget the fact that we need to go back and actually do some real work at this moment to actually bring about the type of change that we'd like to see happen.
And that's what always brings me back to my skepticism, is that the moment it actually becomes work and the moment it comes at a real cost is the moment when all of a sudden people run to saying it's gone too far, or folks have asked for too much, right? So on the one hand, you know, the fact that the low-hanging fruit didn't even used to be fruit. I mean, you know, that people are realizing that there is another side of history and that their stance could come at a cost seems like something, but you're right. You know, the moment that, you know, Sandy Darity's coming in a few weeks to have a conversation about reparations, the moment that we start saying, what does that actually mean? You know, what does that look like?
Yeah. I keep thinking about the great Nina Simone song, Mississippi Goddamn. And there's a point in the song where she chides white Americans like that, you know, we make demands and you keep telling us to go slow. And she's like, you know, it's no time to go slow now. And, you know, this is a unique moment, right? If COVID is not happening, some of that youthful energy that we saw in the streets the last couple of weeks, you know, they're doing internships, they're taking summer courses, they're starting their new jobs, they're preparing for graduate school. You know, they don't have time, right, to be out in the street. And so, you know, it really is a kind of intersection of interesting moments of what was going on that allowed for us to see this kind of political energy. And that kind of, those intersections aren't going to exist forever.
Right. So you're saying that it's not the intersections, it's not simply the kind of pile up of horrors that seem to hit Black folks disproportionately, but that as a kind of side effect of that pile up, people are available for this in a way.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think many Americans generally were feeling vulnerable that the state hasn't done what it needed to do to protect them in the COVID moment, that those are the kind of issues that also intersected with what Black folks have been demanding, feeling vulnerable historically in that way.
One of the many books that I have brainstormed and not finished writing over the course of my, sort of post-child time was a book that really thought about the 1970s and Black veterans of the Vietnam War, because there are a couple of different stories to tell, right? There's my dad and all of his friends who were wandering around the Atlanta suburbs playing golf. And that's a story of college educated, mostly men or men who went to officer candidate school, who climbed class through military service and the opportunities afforded by it, often through career military service. And then there's a story of all of the folks who were utterly abandoned, right? Folks who were swept up in the draft to get protesters off the streets and then like sent overseas to do something terrible and then left. But it's a digression. Somebody should write that book. I'm not going to. Somebody should write that book. But what struck me too, and one of the underlying questions for me in thinking about this book is, how is it that we abandoned the notion of the public and public good exactly at the moment when African Americans, after the legislative gains of the 1960s, had the potential to really be fully integrated and empowered in public life, right? I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think one of the things that we see 50 years out from that, or almost 50 years out from that, is then kind of investment in public life and the commons that has become so bereft and paltry that everyone is suffering from the sort of willful holding on.
Absolutely. And I think when we see that energy in the streets, it speaks to the fact that so many people feel as though the state has abandoned them.
Yeah.
You know, and until it actually happened to them, it's like that classic joke that, you know, when white folks catch a cold, black folks catch pneumonia.
Right.
That literally is what we've seen play out,
Right.
you know, over the last 3 or 4 months. Thinking about, you know, the books that we can't write, and we could have a whole conversation about what it means to be on the front line at an institution like Duke when these things happen, and having to put our research aside,
Right.
you know, to deal with those moments of crisis. But one of the things I know you're doing a book now that's actually dealing with kind of policing in the post-civil rights era, civil rights, post-civil rights era. And I think it's important, and I'm thinking about the language that we've heard from many folks over the last couple of months. I'm thinking specifically now, Robin Kelly, and this language of a third Reconstruction. Right, if we think about the first Reconstruction being about slavery, the second Reconstruction being about democracy and voting, and this third Reconstruction being about dealing with police brutality. And it's a long history, right? It's not just about 2020. It's not about, you know, 2014 and Mike Brown. You know, this is something that goes back to the very reason why Watts exploded in '65, right? And gave us Johnny Cochran, right, as a national figure. So can you talk a little bit about this longer history, you know, of Black folks trying to confront police brutality in their communities and also nationally?
Sure. I mean, and so I can stop at the place where my book, or I can start at the place where my book begins, which is 1985 in San Diego, when a Black man is pulled over by police officers on a pretext, by one police officer in particular, who it comes out in the young man's trial is excessively and egregiously racist, right? So racist that other police officers in San Diego are calling him out for being racist. And it becomes violent. The police officer starts beating him. Someone else called in, another police officer, 2 men are beating him. But the young man is brown belt in Taekwondo. And so he defends himself till the moment that he is convinced that the policeman is going to kill him. And then he disarms that policeman and shoots both of those policemen with the police revolver, wounding one, killing the other, goes to trial. And I mean, and so there are all of these, right? You hear that and you're like, what? And then he goes to trial and he's not convicted because the defense makes such a good case that the police officer was a menace, that he is acquitted after 2 trials. And so if I were to stop the story there, that would be like a story of triumph and we'd all feel really good. If you follow that man's life out, he is destroyed. He is destroyed by this encounter. His family is wrecked by it. All sorts of people around him are wrecked by it. He's acquitted in part because a community of folks who are sort of activists in various kind of corners come together. There's someone who's like part of the Congress of African Peoples, right? So he's like a sort of pals with Baraka. There's the Black Muslims, because his grandfather is a pillar of the community, had started the Nation Mosque, which then becomes a Sunni mosque before this happens, right? And then there's another activist who had sort of been in the face of the San Diego Police Department because his complaints about the San Diego Police Department dated back to when he had gotten to San Diego in the Navy in the 1950s, right? So there are all of these people with their own interactions with over-the-top policing, and also who are moved by Sagan Penn, the young man who's attacked because he is a sweet kid who just got jammed up. But their politics, their frustrations and their articulations come from decades-long interactions with the police. And we see that, right? Like, so Penn is 85 in San Diego. You mentioned the 1960s all over the US. We go back, I always bring up the We Charge Genocide pamphlet, right? That folks took to the UN, and that's 1951. And when they're listing the things that are done to African Americans that are practices of state violence that they argue should legally add up to being the term genocide, they talk about some extra legal violence, lynchings, but really it's list after list after list of people's violent and deadly encounters with the police, right? And then we could keep going back, We could
Right.
keep going back. My World War I book has Black women kidnapped and raped by police officers. So this is just, at some point you realize, you know, we're all rejecting the idea of bad apples, but what we really need to get is that police violence as a practice of state violence is built into the architecture of maintaining and furthering white supremacy as a system of political economy, right? And so if you want to see an America that looks like the America that many white folks thought that they already had, you've got to get in there and undo like a practice that is as old as the modern state itself, the modern American state.
Let me ask you about this gender piece for a second, because you know what you just said about your World War I book struck a chord. You know, there's a young woman in New York City, you know, who was raped by 2 police officers a few years ago. The case went to court. The 2 officers were acquitted, and one of the things that came out of that story is that, for all intents and purposes, in 35 U.S. states, it is legal for police officers to have consensual sex with women who are in custody, i.e. to be able to rape women who are in custody. How does that play out in how we think about police violence against Black women? Because also one thing that we rarely talk about, right? We can talk about how all of us drove to support the idea of George Floyd, but that same kind of energy we didn't see for Breonna Taylor. Right. And an act of violence that was just as egregious, if not more so. How do we deal with the gender dynamic within this conversation?
I mean, there are a million different places to go with that answer, right? And one of them is that there's a long history within African American freedom struggles of balancing Black women understanding a kind of intersectional experience and need, and foregrounding Black men. I mean, originally it's because, you know, they were sort of pushing the vote where someone could vote, right? So pre-1920, Black men's struggles were kind of foregrounded because they could work on behalf of the whole race, right? But there also becomes a way in which I think countering a patriarchal system with an assertion of one's better patriarchy is a corruption of many kinds of freedom struggles, right? And so that's a little bit of what's going on in there too. And the attack on Black women's bodies, you can think of as a participation of, like, you know, what is the quote that, like, women are the verb that men use to sort of fight with one another, right? That if you think about the Reconstruction or the Jim Crow era, when police officers or other white men went in and raped African American women, sometimes in front of their family, in the case of like Memphis in 1866 or 1868, whatever that was. And then after, when they kidnapped Black teachers off the street, in the case of my book, and drove them to the edge of town with a whole bunch of folks standing around and watching in horror, but not very many of them moving, that was saying, you don't have the capacity or the right to protect your women, right? Which means that you aren't men, which means that you aren't citizens. So all of that is wrapped up in this story. I think it also bears saying that, you know, as you know, the insanity of saying that police officers can have consensual sex with prisoners. Like, how do you have consensual sex with a prisoner? Right? The like erasure of the realities of power in that. It's like when people are like, did Thomas Jefferson love Sally Hemings? I think so. And I'd be like, I don't know. The human heart is complicated and has many chambers, and people do all sorts of things, crazy things, but that question is irrelevant to the discussion at hand. That's long-winded and circling around to stuff and not actually getting right to your answer. But I will also throw in that big pile of thoughts that I think too about, I mean, I always think about Sandra Bland because I just find that story wrenching and horrifying, and it's, you know, immediate and in the front of my brain, but also Joan Little, in North Carolina in the 1970s, who her jailer tries to assault her and she kills him in self-defense. And so the question becomes, does she get punished for this act of self-defense, or does she get acquitted? And I actually think the past instances where Black folks have asserted their right to defend themselves and it's been accepted, right? The Saigon Pen case that I'm writing about, or Joan Little's case, has actually made our present even harder. Because what happens in those instances is not that the broad public goes, oh, we were wrong, you were right, Black Lives Matter. They say, okay, what do we have to do to ensure that this never plays out this way again?
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of the way that, you know, both white and Black folks thought about Jack Johnson, you know, in the early 20th century, right? He had relative freedoms, but because he had those relative freedoms, that meant, you know, other Black folks had to catch more hell because of the freedoms that he had, right? So Black folks were just as critical of Jack Johnson for what he tried to get away with, you know, than white folks were, you know, upset because he got away with some things.
So what do we do with the fact that the Jack Johnson movie is going forward now, right? Like in this moment, what does it say about this moment?
Yeah, you know, is America ready for a Jack Johnson movie without a full historical context in what creates Jack Johnson and why he had to disappear in the way that he did? You know, I was always struck in John McCain's last decade. You know, he was on this whole thing to get, you know, the sentences against Jack Johnson commuted. And I never understood the motivation for that at this period of time. You know, when there's so many other Black folks who've been unfairly imprisoned, right? Some who are still in prison, right? Who, you know, let's talk about Mumia for a second, you know, whose, you know, sentences should be commuted and what have you. I think it's often easier, and this is going to, you know, segue into my question for you about these monuments. It's easier to deal in the past than it is to deal with the present. And so, you know, as you mentioned earlier, the question about the monuments, so monuments are coming down, right? Confederate flags are coming down. There's some of us, and, you know, we supposed to spend some time in the classroom, you know, watching all these media companies try to erase every evidence of blackface that exists in their archives. And, you know, I teach Birth of the Nation every semester, right? I kind of want to continue to teach Birth of a Nation. I've often wanted to teach Song in the South, but, you know, Disney has allowed that, you know, into public domain. How do you feel about this question about whether or not we pull down these symbols of racism and white supremacy and anti-Black sentiment, or the idea that we maintain them so that we can remember the crimes that happened and remember the history that happened?
You know, I go back and forth on this all the time. And I think about it because, like, I went to Yale for graduate school, and I got to Yale and I was walking down the street, and I loved New Haven because it was filled with Black people from the Carolinas. And, you know, like, it felt familiar in a million different ways. And I'm like enjoying myself, and I look up and I was like, Calhoun College. Like, why the heck would the Yankeeist institution in, like, the history of Yankee institutions have a college named for John C. Calhoun, right? Asking that question then made me think, I need to spend a little more time thinking about, like, the relationship between the wealthy North and the wealthy South, and how utterly reliant they were on Southern cotton and Southern slavery. And that's not, you know, it's not about being located in the place, it's being part of a system. You know, I probably would have come to that conversation or that realization some other way if the college hadn't been so oddly named. But that's how I got there. And it's also true that there are a million of people who are not historically minded who would have walked past that forever and never used it to have that conversation. I grew up in a sort of wonderful, in some ways, an insane town outside of Atlanta that is convinced that it is where terror would be located if Gone with the Wind were real. And they don't seem to quite realize that Gone with the Wind is not real. So there was Terra everything. There's the Terra Church of Christ, there's Terra Boulevard, there's the Confederate Cemetery, there was a reenactment of the Battle of Jonesboro, like downtown. And I grew up knowing all of those things were strange. And, you know, sort of like in some dark way, very funny to me. They never wounded me, they never hurt me, they had no effect on how I thought about myself. I never looked at any of that stuff, never noticed Confederate monuments, really. I'm sure there were some there, never took them in. That said, if I'd lived in Richmond, Virginia, where you can't drive down the super fancy street without seeing an ever taller statue after statue after statue, that's a different, right? Like, memorials occupy space, or monuments occupy space differently. They do different work in different space. They also do different work in different times. And it's one thing for me to have been in like 1985 Jonesboro not paying attention, but 1985 Jonesboro, it was Reagan's America, which was its own problem, but it was still the kind of end of the integration project. And there was still an optimism and at least an articulated commitment to carrying forth the goals of 20 years before. We're in Trump's 2020. And again, it's low-hanging fruit. It is not the kind of, you know, as you said, hard and terrible and wrenching work that matters, but they've become alive again, right? And they're screaming at people, and they are sites of rallying for the deplorables. And given the work that they have started doing over again, I'm okay with just removing them all. I think we should.
You mentioned the deplorables, and I'd like to frame that in a different way. You know, one of the things we dealt with, you know, prior to say 65, you know, we're talking about a century of lynching, for instance. You know, there is what I guess you would term extra legal violence against Black folks. And the police existed as a terror, but you often understood that there was a terror that was unnamed and invisible, that was much more of a threat than the police, even when the police themselves were members of the Klan and some of these other organizations. You know, what we've seen over the last 50 years is that extra legal violence has suddenly gone underground to a certain extent. And now that violence is directly correlated to policing within our communities, what some folks might even describe as the occupying of our communities in that context. Do you have any fear that now that we're trying to reform or even defund or revolutionize how policing is done in this country, that we'll now see the reemergence of these extra forces to bring bringing to bear forms of violence? I mean, part of what we saw with Aubrey early on in February is an example of this, right? All these examples of these, you know, lynchings that have occurred, Black men hanging in Los Angeles, right, suggest that that's where we're going. And so how do we process that in this moment where there are no real legal constraints really to protect Black folks within that situation?
Yeah, I mean, that is a wonderful question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer. I mean, the line between legal and extra legal violence, as you mentioned, those legal, the officers of law and order, the forces of law and order, were often the same folks, along with the minister and the coroner or whoever, in the mobs. And so we need to be clear about that. And what happens, I think, on some level, is that Jim Crow ordinances or Jim Crow practices get written into colorblind legislation so that the police, like very expressly, so that the police can take over that role. And you can, Anders Walker, who's a law professor at St. Louis University, has a book called Ghosts of Jim Crow, where he read through state legislature, like, what do you call them, minutes, the discussions that they had as they were figuring out how to take X law and get it to pass muster, right? But still, outsourcing that work to the police, outsourcing vigilante justice to the police does leave vigilantes without a job to do. And you're right, there's a way that they're getting their jobs back, right? But I mean, I'm worried about it, but there's some part of me, as you just mentioned, Ahmaud Arbery, we're already there, Mark. I mean, I was gonna ask you a question about what do we make of all of the crazy people who are shouting racial slurs and waving their guns when a camera is pointed on them, right? Because not only is there, space for them to come back out and sort of claim that vigilantism, but there's a confidence that they can adopt and pull on the language of Black criminality, which is also old.
Right.
Or I was in fear of my life. I swear I turned that thing off. I was in fear for my life, and they won't get in trouble for it.
Right, stand around, right.
Yeah, the St. Louis lawyer from the other day with his assault weapon, who was like, a mob came at me. And I was like, I don't think you get to talk about a mob when people with placards are walking past two folks with a gun. You're a small mob, but you guys are the mob.
Right. And the president has successfully, in some cases dog whistle, but in some cases just blatantly encourage folks. I mean, what we saw in Charlottesville, right, it was almost a blatant encouragement. Why don't y'all go take to the streets, right? Because y'all are good people too, right? One of the questions that's come up in this moment that's forced me to rethink policing. I've heard conversations about defunding the police for a long time, but never had a reason to really dig deeply into what that meant. And when I finally took the time to read and listen to what it meant, is like, oh, aha, right, that makes sense. And one of the ways it was made so explicit to me was the resource officers that populate public schools all throughout this country, where you will have 3 or 4 resource officers assigned to a school, but there's not a full-time social worker. There's a nurse who's only there twice a week. There's no therapist at all found in the school. And you're wondering, what if we diverted some of those funds going to the resource officers and actually deal with these human conditions? Obviously, there might not be a reason for these resource officers. And I say all of that to raise to you, we're both parents. Your babies are much younger than my babies. One of my babies is an adult.
One of your babies babysat my babies.
What kind of conversations are you having with your children about this moment? And also, have you had to navigate while they were in school around these kinds of issues, right? I mean, when folks talk about, the school to prison pipeline, that's not some crazy fantasy, right? There's enough data to suggest that there's something at play there that as parents, as communities, we have to really be concerned about.
It's interesting. So my older daughter, I have a daughter who's older and a son who's younger, but my daughter has always been very attuned to the dynamics that play out in her. She's in the Durham Public Schools, but it's a magnet school, and I got schooled by Nicole Hannah-Jones on how that is basically, as she said, a way to keep white people in public schools. And Zora is very attuned to how what she thinks of as neighborhood, but that's a shorthand for class, really affects how kids get like this. Not fully. I mean, I think Morehead's a wonderful school in a lot of ways, but on some level, it is true that the children who get narrated as perpetual problems tend to be the children who don't live in the Professor or RTP neighborhoods.
Right.
And by and large, they are Black or Latino children. Like Zora named that in the 3rd grade.
Yeah. Right.
And she worried about her friend who she'd known since daycare, for whom this was happening. She's also very clear that she is, nurtured and beloved. I mean, it's really been beautiful the way that they have everything that they've given her. But she is a biracial, light-skinned professor, daughter of 2 professors, right? And so she she doesn't like, she's not going to turn away affection, but she also understands already that she is being treated as an exception. And she's still figuring out how to give language for a critique for that, of that, like to say what it is, but she has signaled it to me. Langston, I worry about all the time because he is far less invested in having people tell him how awesome he is. He's certain he's awesome, but he like lives in his head and he floats around. And again, it's a good experience, but you know, after George Floyd was killed and the kids were like, what's going on? I sat him down and I was like, Langston, all those times that I tell you to use your words instead of folding in on yourself and glaring at me, it's because, well, one, you're driving me crazy, but two, because I am worried about you and my job is to make sure that you are safe. And I cannot control a world that will work hard to make you unsafe, but I can equip you with some tools that will put you like one step closer to home base, you know? Who knows, right? He's not quite 9. Who knows what he's taking in? We're gonna have this conversation over and over again. And on some level, it kills me and infuriates me that we have to have that conversation. Both kids have noted with the school resource officer, who I think might be part-time, I don't even know, but it's always like, I feel kind of bad for him because nobody ever talks to him. I was like, well, I mean, he could build a like sweet relation. I mean, I don't know how that, I was like, maybe he should just needs to be assigned somewhere else, more productive, but I'll be curious to see what the Durham Public Schools and a lot of other public schools do with student resource officers. I mean, it's a euphemism, one, right? And it's an ironic euphemism where it's like, oh, that's where the resources are. They're in you.
Yeah. And, you know, at least for our children going through DPS, and I'm sure for many, you know, folks who live in certain kinds of towns, you know, a resource officer is very different than what I remembered teaching in New York City public schools 30 years ago. And as a student in New York City public schools, where, you know, we were going through metal detectors every day, right? Where they had to check our bags because they were fearful that the violence of outside was going to come into the school. You know, now it's this weird dynamic where, you know, the violence of the outside is already in the school and policing the school in certain kinds of ways. And we have to more protect our children from the state violence in the schools than any violence that could come from the outside, you know, randomly and what have you.
So what kind of conversations have you had with your girls?
So, you know, my oldest daughter, who's the one that I beat upside the head with information, listening to NPR in the car and forcing her to read books and things like that. And it was always, yeah, Dad, I get it. But okay, you know, maybe it's a little too much. And part of it was, you know, she had this innate ability, and it's really hard to explain, but she had this innate ability to have white people be very, very comfortable with her. So she didn't often, you know, experience those kind of interactions. The fact that she was a competitive swimmer and very often was one of the only Black people around, right? I mean, she developed these interesting relationships and kinships, you know, with white folks, but it really took her going to college. She was a second-year student, and an athlete on another sports team called her an N-word, right, at a party, right? And trying to put pressure on the athletic director, her coach, who was unresponsive, the baseball coach in this case, because it was a baseball player. I still have the message on my phone of the baseball coach calling me, you know, because my daughter didn't tell us for 3 weeks because she didn't want me to respond because she didn't know how that was going to go. But she finally told me, you know, I sent an email to everybody, and then the baseball coach called me in tears, right? Because he couldn't imagine this happened. And we know from all our kids, you know, regardless, you know, collegiate athletes, Black, they experience all these things all the time that never resonate with head coaches and athletic directors. And so she's had a come to Jesus moment over the last few years, right? That included everything from growing her hair out into an afro, and, digging into the classics. I just, mailed her a bunch of Toni Morrison books a few days ago.
Nice.
But with my youngest daughter, who, much like your daughter, she picked up on things a lot. She often jokes, because I left so many books around the house, and she was a voracious reader, so she would just start reading stuff, right? So she had stuff in her head that she shouldn't have had, at certain ages. And, she was in third or fourth grade when she pulled up on a teacher. It's like, I realized that, we're tracking Black and Latino students in ways that we don't track white students, right? Which immediately marked her as a problem in the school, right? Because she was always the kid that would pick up on things and then raise that and advocate for her peers amongst teachers, which means raising her in these schools has been a challenge, right? Because she's always a problem child. And I would argue, unlike your daughter, because she's a dark-skinned Black girl, that resonated a certain kind of way. And what she's read is that she's a problem child because you're the child of a professor. Right, in ways that other Black kids, we don't have to deal with, right? So why can't you just be like the other Black kids, right? And, I'm interested in seeing how all of our children are going to turn out 10, 15 years from now, right? Both processing everything that COVID has meant for the last 6 months, and then everything that's happening now. This is the first time in my life where I don't have a clear sense of what comes next. Right. And, a lot of that is, arrogance. Right. Particularly as scholars, right? We're arrogant about a bunch of stuff, right? And so we think we know and can describe what's going to happen next. But, on a personal level and also professionally, I'm not clear what comes next in this moment, right? Because what's happened over the last 5 or 6 months is just so unprecedented.
Yeah, I guess I'll scratch that question. What comes next, Mark Anthony? But actually, I am in some ways very much an institutions person, right? Like for me, the political apparatus, I'm one of those folks who believes that if the vote didn't matter, people wouldn't be trying so hard to keep Black folks from voting, right? But I know I have a lot of friends who are kind of ahead of me, right? Like I'm Barack Obama to everybody else's Cornel West on some level, ahead in a different place. I shouldn't actually rank those on sort of order of preference. How important do you think November is? I don't know. Talk about places where I refuse to imagine good things, but what does the response to, does the response to all of the protests right now where people are like, well, if you're going to protest, you need to register to vote. Is that a meaningful response or is that just more nonsense?
So I think voting is just one avenue towards being engaged politically, right? One can be engaged politically and not vote, not being registered, right? That's just one particular platform. I know there was a lot of criticism of Colin Kaepernick, once his protest became public and folks found out that he, wasn't registered to vote. But I think the moment demands that all hands on deck, and voting has to be in our toolkit in this moment. And I know it's real easy to get caught up in the attractiveness of national politics. And our current president has made it very easy, right, for folks to become engaged. But I often remember that, this kind of uptick in energy and activism around anti-Black violence and police brutality and killings in Black community happened under the watch of a Black president. Right. That in many ways, having Barack Obama in Washington, when you consider unemployment rates and a whole range of other things, did not dramatically impact Black folks other than this concept of hope, right? And an investment in the process. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in national politics that we lose sight of what's happening on the ground in our own communities. When we talk about so many of these police shootings, right? And this played out in some place like Illinois, Well, who's the DA, right? DAs are elected officials, right? We have to pay attention to those cases. We know that, public schooling in North Carolina took a turn 14, 15, 16 years ago because certain party took over, school boards and began to dictate policy, right? Again, most folks don't have any idea who's on the school board in their local communities, let alone, state legislatures and mayors and all these kinds of folks. And so if we're going to invest in the vote, we have to fully invest in the vote on every level of government that impacts upon our lives. And the local stuff is always going to much more dramatically impact our lives on a day-to-day basis, than what's happening in Washington.
I think you're right about that, right? Because we talk again about the big work that when we talk about white supremacy as a system of political economy, we are talking about a structure that is made of tiny little pieces all over the place. And that's what makes it daunting. And that's what makes it feel intractable. But it also means that you go at the piece by piece. And so much of it, like even federal things that get locally administered, you can go in and make a difference. And this is the story, you're exactly right, of 2010, where in 2008, everybody was like, we elected Black president, we done. And the voter turnout for the midterm elections went, and it was the, crazy person takeover.
You think about so-called Obamacare and its inability to be as successful as it could be, even though some of us argue for something a little bit even more, substantial. But, what has made it difficult is state level politicians pushing back against applying it, to actually deal with healthcare issues in their state, right? And that's the best example I can think off the top of my head of national issues that come into a logjam in the context of how they are articulated on a state and local level.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, so you're right, that the vote is only one thing among many. What are some of those, and we're going to lay them out for people, right? Like some of those other things.
We have to be honest about what organized protests looks like. And organized protest is not necessarily, just people marching in the street, but being engaged in systematic organizing. And so many of the fundamental gains that Black folks have experienced in this country over the last 100 years have come from these more traditional formal forms of protests. Whether it's the NAACP choosing the routes that it chose to address those issues, going back to 1909, when you think about the civil rights movement, right, you cannot divorce whatever was achieved in that moment from the use of boycotts in line with protest. And these weren't fly by the moment things, right? These were organized campaigns that were sustained for 2 decades. We think about the March on Washington as kind of a watershed moment in this, but we know there were so many more campaigns that occurred right after that. When we think about the Black Panther Party, looking at the California state constitution, right? And this gets again to, anti-Black police violence, and recognizing, according to the state constitution in California, that they could monitor police interactions in their communities fully armed, right, within 25 feet. Right. And it wasn't until they actually showed up to, right, do what they were legally able to do that the state of California, within months, right, under Governor Ronald Reagan, right, changed the laws, right? And so we know that when people decide to get together and move together, right, it has the potential to move the needle in important ways. And it's a critical moment now because we are now seeing those moments where issues intersect with the needs of the larger populace, right? This was the genius of Martin Luther King in those last years of his life, the last months of his life in particular, in a Poor People's Campaign, recognizing there were poor white folks who were left out of that process also, right? And I would argue it was, in fact, those last 6 months, because he was organizing poor whites, that made him much more dangerous than he ever was, right, when the concerns were about Black people sitting on the back of a bus.
Right. It's like when Martin Luther King and Fred Hampton start feeling like they're in the same territory, right? And I mean, well, so mentioning King and mentioning that.
And you can't just get rid of Fred Hampton, because if you get rid of Fred Hampton, it just moves King further to the left, right? So the strategy is, well, we got to cut the beast off at the head.
But there's also something about charismatic leadership. Like the movement outlived both King and Hampton, because actually, as much as these kind of like, again, sort of amazing, and they were amazing, I mean, but like amazing Black men stand out front, they exemplify, they aren't the totality of the movements that they speak for.
Right.
I've heard people, I think somebody actually asked me this question recently, where they were like, well, we've had criticisms of the protests right now because there's not a movement like in the civil rights, or there's not a leader like in the civil rights movement. There's not an identifiable leader. And my response was, well, one, I would mark that as a sign of their success, right? That it's, and two, you might want to go back and read more about the civil rights movement. Right? Like, that's not the organizing model that really like drove the story. But I think that there's something still very gendered about that imagination of what like the foreperson of a movement looks like.
Yeah. The genius of Ella Baker, and we can't talk about her enough, she wasn't interested in producing leaders. She was interested in producing leadership for communities that needed leadership. And those are two very different things. She wasn't interested in identifying this person lead them, but creating context in which leadership would emerge within those communities based on their needs, which is why she was never supportive of having the national figures come in to organize people on the ground. Her argument is always the people are already there on the ground to provide leadership. We just need to provide them resources and support for that. And I always remember, one of my favorite essays in, Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Last Black Hero, right? In which, he raises this very interesting story of what happens when what we presume is natural leadership within the Black community, heterosexual Black men married to Black women, right? What happens when that model is no longer tenable? Right, and we have to look for models of leadership outside of that context. What was so important about, Black Lives Matter is that you had these three queer Black women that everyone understood within the context of that movement as providing the important leadership for it. And a lot of the critiques that you heard from the older guard, which is often there was the leadership movement, was the fact that they didn't recognize that as legitimate leadership. The fact that we're not having a moment on the ground now in which the faces that we don't see at the forefront of any of these conversations aren't named Sharpton or Jackson or Farrakhan, right, suggests that there's been a dramatic shift. The fact that we're not talking about the Urban League and the NAACP and the Nation of Islam, right, suggests that there's been a rupture in notions of what leadership is and what folks are achieving. I mean, that's part of the reason why, for me personally, I'm like, I don't know what's to come next, because part of my job now is really to support the folks who are pushing the movement in a certain kind of direction.
I remember, decades ago, I saw Julian Bond give a talk and someone raised their hand and said, when are you going to hand over the reins of leadership? And he was basically like, when are you going to take it? Right? Like, it wasn't, you don't just sit around. It's not like a relay race. It's like, if you see that it needs to be done, come forward. And so in this moment, there's some part of me that's like, oh, they took it.
That's what we're seeing. Absolutely.
And it is. I am cynical and I am tired and I am skeptical and I am relieved that there are people with more energy and vision than I have. Right? And I will give them the tools that I have to give them. I think being a college professor, actually, and being a college professor who's willing to move outside of the formal spaces of the academy to talk about what I know is offering something valuable.
So let me ask you this question, closer to home, or closer to work in this regard. We've been here long enough to been privy to many conversations of concern about race on campus, race in the world off of campus that's going to impact campus. How do you see this moment playing out at our institution at this moment, right? What kind of expectations do you think for us as Black scholars in this moment? What kind of expectations should we have for the institution and its leadership? All right, and particularly thinking about the ways in which this moment, again, intersects with what's happening around COVID, right? As we're talking about the university thinking about or planning to open up in the fall, this is historically African-American city. Duke is the largest private employer in Durham, the second largest private employer in the state of North Carolina. When we think about the lowest rung of folks who work at Duke, they look like our mamas and our daddies, and our aunties and our uncles and our grandmothers and our grandfathers. You know, how do we think about going forward at Duke, caring for the least in a COVID moment, at the same time, trying to take care of the business of race also in this moment?
Yeah, I don't, I mean, again, you keep asking me questions and my response is, I don't know. But this is a particularly fraught and vexing one, right? Because apparently we're going forward. And I wonder how far we'll get before we have to stop going, right? Like I mean, I say this about Duke, I say this about UNC, I say this about every school that's offering its plan for opening, and the plans sound like the best way if you're going to do it, but the underlying question of, is this responsible, is a hard question to answer.
Including if you're at UNC redefining 6 feet as 3 feet. That's a whole nother conversation.
Right. I mean, I think we're about to be worked to death in a million different ways, and I hope that that is figurative and not literal statement. But somebody, I mean, at one of these institutions, be it ours, be it Carolina, be it somewhere, like someone's going to get really sick. And when it happens at one school, all of the schools are going to need to hit the pause button and think about it. I also wonder, I mean, you and I both participated in the Living While Black Symposium, where Black faculty, staff, and students spoke to an audience of 6,000 people, which is no small audience, about the lived experience, both the sort of intellectual and analytical stuff, but the lived experience about being Black in this and broader communities. And I think that the administration was sincere in its desire and commitment to do something, to try to imagine a different version of Duke. We're also in a moment where the financial impacts of the COVID crisis and all of the ways that we've had to adapt are about to hit all universities really hard. Right. And I don't know what's going to happen when those two priorities and imperatives run up against one another. And I think, you know, I wish that I had an articulation and a vision that allowed people to see that reimagining the university for the future, the best plan for it is actually to reimagine a transformed university where Black people and Indigenous people and other historically underrepresented groups in the United States are at the fore of a lot of faculty and student and intellectual, like in which they really rework the community to like be like the most ideal American project that we've heard people articulate, right? Like we want Duke to like be like Frederick Douglass University somewhere deep in its soul. And that's going to cost money at a time when we don't have a lot, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. It's about choosing what you spend your money on.
It's interesting you mentioned Frederick Douglass University. I mean, one of the interesting kind of histories of Duke that we don't talk enough about in terms of Durham, you know, were those students and administrators who broke off from Duke, you know, after the Allen Building takeover to set up Malcolm X Liberation University right here in Durham. And it was an important model because it was a model that attempted to bridge the resources of Duke as a university with the community. And it's almost something that we need to think about going back to reproducing in this moment, because wherever Duke is, right, financially in this moment, it's often still going to be much more and better resources,
right,
than
anywhere else around.
right? And so, you know, what does that look like for the university going forward?
Harry, I'll let you talk in a second, but I always end things by recommending people books. And so I'd say, like, on this topic specifically, and you're right, I mean, what you're reminding me, Mark, is that we don't have to imagine it. It's not like people haven't done this visionary and imaginative work before, but 2 books for people who are interested in Duke and Durham: Christina Green's Our Separate Ways, which is on women and the Black freedom movement in Durham, but has a little bit on Howard Fuller and has a little bit on Malcolm X Liberation University. And then Russell Rickford's We Are an African People, which actually gets into all kinds of beautiful and remarkable and kind of sometimes kind of impractical but still meaningful Pan-Africanist visions for Pan-Africanist education.
And if you get a chance to check out Stanley Nelson's documentary Boss, which talks a little bit about John Merrick, critical figure he was in North Carolina as a businessman, and his relationship with the Dukes, you know, that allowed him to create the kind of resources that he was able to create for Black Durham, you know, more than a century ago.
Thank you so much, guys. Would love to give you guys a couple of the questions that we've got, some really interesting questions here. I think one of the ones that's come up a few times is when we think about the role of the removal of statues, the removal of names, and obviously the NFL just came out with that in week 1, they're going to start with the performance of the Black National Anthem. Are these things actually meaningful? And how do you contextualize them with the type of change that will really push the needle forward? You know, when we take the example of the removal of names from buildings, what about the issues of race underneath that? Will Colin Kaepernick get a job? If he doesn't, what does that look like? So we'd love to hear both of you kind of describe these symbolic changes that we're seeing and what you expect to come out of them, and ultimately the influence that they'll have.
Will Colin Kaepernick get back pay for all the years he was kept out of a job? Is the other question.
That's yeah, you know, I won't say that it's not meaningful, right? I think it's important that we see the movement on these symbols, but they are just that, symbols, right? It's symbolic, right? If it's not undergirded by real reimaginations of the way that we live our lives and our interactions with institutions and systems, right, that, you know, have existed for centuries, you know, all we're doing is really just tearing the Band-Aid off, and there's still a wound there, you know, to use a well-parsed metaphor.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I have the same answer. And this is, I mean, part of that symbology, though, that I also, I mean, we talked a little bit before everybody came and joined us in this webinar about how I don't know what to do with the fact that Cam Newton just went to the New England Patriots. Because, you know the Michael Che joke from SNL when the Falcons played the Patriots was about, like, Atlanta's blackness and New England's racism. And so it's like, the Patriots have a Black quarterback. Like, what? Right? And it's not deep, it's not enough. And yet there is still some part of me that is, like, goggling at it.
Yeah, let's hope that Cam spends a few nights, you know, giving Bill Russell a phone call about what it means to be a star living in Boston.
Yeah, he should buy, in like a Black community on Martha's Vineyard, at least. Like, uses.
Another question that we had come up a number of times is, what can our non-Black allies do, both in terms of, you know, their interactions on the ground, and then think about, you know, some of the policies that they can assist in furthering?
This is going to sound harsh, but we can start with, don't ask me how I'm doing. Because whatever is happening to us right now is not brand new to us. And while we can appreciate the sentiment, the larger question is not how we're feeling, but how you are feeling about all of this and what you're willing to do and interacting with your family, with your community, in your schools, in your neighborhoods, in your place of employment, right, to advocate for the kinds of concerns that we have been articulating for such a long time.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot lately about what the relationship is between like notions of allyship or solidarity or coalition, because they're all kind of different things, but connected things. And for me, I have far more faith in coalition than I do in solidarity or allyship, because coalition means recognizing and naming a common interest. And so there's some part of me that's like, start by this, start by seeing that you're not doing things on behalf of Black people, you're doing things on behalf of like the commons. Again, because the commitment to maintaining white supremacy and holding resources in the hands of a few and of controlling certain people's labor or getting rid of labor when the economy changes and there's nowhere for it to go. Like all of those things do damage to everyone. So acknowledge that they hit Black people disproportionately, acknowledge that the practices of an equal state practice or an equal state power are perfected on like sort of Black and Indigenous communities, but then say this is bad for white folks, and go talk to them about how good it will be for them to get their crap together.
And while you're, downloading that Robin DiAngelo book, White Fragility, which is incredibly important, there are lots of Black writers who've been writing about these issues for a long time, right? Right here at Duke, our own Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Racism Without Racist. I think about the work that Ibram Kendi has been doing with his book, Anti-Black, Anti-Racist, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's a lot of work to be done. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of research already done on this. One of the best things you could do is just educate yourself on what's happening and what people are thinking about.
I feel that people could learn, if folks would read Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, and like a good biography of Ida B. Wells, like think of the round education that they would get.
And John Hope Franklin from Slavery to Freedom, right?
And John Hope Franklin from Slavery to Freedom.
Another question that's come up a couple of times, and I think later in the lecture series, we're probably going to explore this over the course of an entire lecture, is about economic reparations. But would love to hear both of your thoughts on the potential for economic reparations and the changes that if some form of reparations were given, that could ultimately come about.
So the first thing, in order to, this is where like somebody needs to boom, insert Sandy Darity, but we need to think very seriously about the way in which wealth has been built and passed on in this country, right? We need to talk first about the relationship between slavery and capitalism, not simply within the US, but within the global economy, right? And to be honest about that. And we need to be able to talk about the inequities that are built into capitalism. That's like whether you are a capitalist, pro or anti, like admit it, right? Someone is going to not get stuff. And you need to be able to name white supremacy as an argument that racializes and justifies those inequities of capitalism through the racialization of people that we've come to understand as Black. So that the history of like race and economics is like, it's deep and it's really interwoven, right? So until we are serious about that part of the analytical work, then our conversations around reparations are going to be foolish, right? And what we also need to understand once we understand that part of the analytical work is that we're not talking about a sort of like one-on-one transfer of payment from one guilty white person to like a grumpy Black person. We're talking about the state. In some ways it's akin to the conversations around like defunding or resourcing police stuff, right? That the state has a role to play in investing literally into Black communities and institutions.
I had a interesting experience on Twitter over the weekend. I posted a piece from Mother Jones about young Blacks who are interested in farming. And the way the article was titled was that, Blacks want to reclaim farmland. And immediately there was this reaction, from white folks, well, they want to get land, they can just go buy it. Or I'm not giving up my land, right? As if the state, first of all, doesn't own a large chunk of whatever we define as land in this country. But that historical piece that most folks have no idea that Black folks were larger landowners at a different point in time in this country, and that it was systematically taken away from. What was Wilmington in '98 about? Yes, it was about political power, but it was also about removing Black people from land that they owned and property that they owned. Tulsa in 1921 was about removing Black people from land that they own. And those are just the stories that we know the most about, right? That happened almost every place where Black folks own land, right? Malcolm X was politicized because they were trying to remove him and his family from the land that they owned, right? And which, ended up in the killing of his father. And so the analytic work plus the historical work, one of the things that Sandy has been really good about is that immediately you will hear folks when you talk about Black reparations, well, what about reparations for this group or that group? And he's always been clear that if that's a case that needs to be made, you need to make the case. That his focus on is not that other cases of reparations are illegitimate, right? But they have to be driven by the organization of people who are most concerned about those things.
Right. Two more book recommendations. Adriane Petty's book, which I can't remember the title of, which is on Black farmers, and Pete Daniel book, Dispossessed, which is also about or dispossession about Black farmers. I love recommending books.
So Mark, I wanted to piggyback on something you just said. Obviously, both you and Professor Lentz-Smith have a sizable social media presence. When you think about, how you interact with various folks on social media in terms of how a lot of people project their views out there. And then also from the perspective that the President of the United States is incredibly active on social media and spreading various views. Like, how does this economy, this economy, kind of play out in terms of social media, and kind of what do you see happening in terms of its role, as we push forward?
So for me, my engagement with social media, particularly Twitter, has always been premised on the fact that there's a hunger for information. And that in the absence of information, folks will consume whatever they consume. And so I've always saw myself in this role. One, it's a pedagogical role, right? I would argue about 80% of the work that I do on social media is pedagogical. But as a gateway, as a resource for information. There are very few, I would say maybe 5% of the tweets that I do on a regular basis are coming from a personal perspective. I'm typically sharing links to information and other people's works and things of that nature. And it struck me a couple of days ago when Terry Crews was trending for something else that he said stupid on Twitter. And I made the quote, I tweeted, "It's never going to be a good day when Terry Crews is trending." And someone immediately tweeted back, well, I think you should stand down, Terry Crews, because Professor Neal never tweets this way. But again, when you think about the work that, really yeoman work that Sandy Darity does on Twitter, I have a running joke about the members of my department, Carla Holloway, who's now an emeritus professor, Sandy Darity, who's one, if not the senior most person in our department. Other than myself, they are the two people who are most active on social media, right? Folks that I would never have thought about, gravitating to the forum. But when you see the content and the context of how they use it, I think it's an incredible resource for us to counter things, particularly at this moment where we have a president, the wrong president, who recognized the power of utilizing social media in the way that he does, that we often have to counter some of that misinformation.
You reposted, or you posted something that you wrote a while back, I think, on Luther Vandross, and thinking about Luther Vandross and kind of sentimentality and emotion. the other day that I just love.
Thank you.
I really.
Yeah.
So when you do post your content, I am happy. I mean, I, by contrast, am not on social media. I'm very much a 20th century person, and I am far too long-winded for the Twitter like form to work. And I would never do anything else if I did that.
Understood. Another thing that's come up is about Pan-Africanism. Would love for you guys to speak a little bit on that.
You know, that's a big conversation. It always has been. Thinking about, you know, because I think unfortunately very often for Black Americans, their engagement with the continent of Africa and various countries within Africa historically has been premised on the fact or the idea that Africa needs Black Americans. And never really seeing the relationship as an equal relationship. I think some of that has shifted over the last 2 decades, clearly with the numbers of, you know, second and third generation college students at elite institutions, you know, that are coming from various countries, Ghana, Nigeria, you know, what have you. And the fact that, you know, when we look to Africa now, not an Africa that's being framed by American imperialism, but because of social media and technology in Africa that can represent itself in the world, we see a much more balanced relationship, and I think much more of an opportunity to do the kind of collaborative work that when we go back and think about folks like Du Bois and their investment in Pan-Africanism, that they would have been very excited about.
Yeah, I also think that a lot of times people vocalize politics as they are in the midst of learning them or the nuances of them, right? And I think if you look from the like World War I era soldiers that I'm writing about, like all the way forward and probably back, so many of the claims of kinship with Africa, so many of the claims of Pan-Africanism were solipsistic, or they were a protest against a feeling of displacement within the United States. And the Africa claim was a way to articulate that didn't stop to incorporate or even think that they needed to a reality of a continent and its diversity and its relationships. And some of the, you know, I think, not that this book does this, but the way that she works through kind of Black Americans' need and the encounter with Africa. I think Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother is a remarkable book. And I assigned it to my first year seminar, alongside Yagayasi's Homegoing, precisely because I wanted them to think about their invocations, their sense of what diaspora was, their sense of what connection and return might mean. And then the other thing that your question makes me think about, because there's also a question not about Africa specifically, but about the way that African Americans both claim their Americanness through patriotic claims, right? It's the 4th of July after all, as you mentioned, and the way that some African Americans have managed to articulate an anti-imperialist stance, but certainly not all, right? And that for some folks, the hyper-American claim, that patriotic claim, actually intensifies a certain kind of American imperialism. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I watched Spike Lee's The Five Bloods last week, which is simultaneously a riveting and not great. I mean, I think even a bad Spike Lee movie is still a fascinating movie that's worth talking about, right? But it's one in which, if you think about it as a reflection on 5 men aging and like sorting through memory and trauma, I love it and it works. I mean, it's flat, but the actors turn those characters out, like make them not caricature. If you actually think like, wow, their Vietnam might as well be like Sylvester Stallone's Vietnam, right? And some of that is deliberate. He's playing with movie tropes and genres, but playing with those genres to show that you can master them doesn't necessarily excuse perpetuating the problems. So, I mean, that's what's on my mind.
I mean, it's that weird dynamic, like when folks don't understand some of the reasons why they're Black Trumpites. Part of it is that for some Black folks, his critiques of immigration intersect with their own, and strongly. The fact that so many conservative whites loved Black Panther, because ultimately what Black Panther was about in many ways was an anti-immigrant message.
Right.
That resonated with, with America in very significant ways, which is why it was as successful as it was, right? If it was a film that was much more critical of some of those imperialist sensibilities, it might not have done as well as it did.
But I'd like to get both of your thoughts on Juneteenth. I would say for 6 months ago, it probably wasn't even in, the vernacular to, most people. And now we're on the verge of maybe thinking about it broadly as a potential national holiday. Were you surprised by this? And, do you see that as something that will happen going forward?
I mean, I'm all for more Black people holidays that come with like good dancing, but talk about low-hanging fruit. Like, this seems like the easiest give in the history of easy gives. It's also interesting because I was talking to my mother recently, and she was saying, who grew up in Louisiana, that she'd never heard of Juneteenth until she moved to Texas in her early 20s. And I was like, yeah, and I hadn't heard anybody talk about it since we moved from Texas when I was in elementary school. And then all of a sudden, this was the season of Juneteenth. And like I said, okay, I think somebody should remember Ralph Ellison in the middle of this, so it'll sell books for his estate. But it just seems a little random. And I'm not opposed to it, but it's not quite what we were asking for. It's like, in police brutality, you get Juneteenth. Thank you.
So, my favorite media thing that I've done in my career was in 2007. I ended up on Michelle Martin's NPR show talking about Juneteenth with the comedian Paul Mooney.
Oh.
Who was hilarious, but on point in so many ways, because he totally disregarded any belief that somehow they showed up in Galveston and Black folks didn't know, right? And there's so much truth to that, right? And so Juneteenth is a really, really messy thing. You're a historian, Adriane, right? You're in a department with historians. Talk to 19th century historians about Juneteenth and the way that we think about emancipation. And Juneteenth itself, in many ways, is meaningless because until the 13th Amendment is ratified 6 months later
right.
by all 50 states, for all intents and purposes, slavery still exists, right? And that what Granger was delivering to the state of Texas, was a message about the Union telling the Confederacy you can no longer have slaves. Right? That even the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't deal with slaves that were in the border states. It literally only, made slaves free in the Confederacy. None of the slaves that still existed in the Union. And there were still a few states there. And so it's a very, very messy history. And I think one of the moments that it becomes important is that in the face of Independence Day, right, it's an important marker of something Black American, right? Unlike Kwanzaa, right, which is really an import from West Africa, seemingly. But it's something that speaks to Black Americans. And understand, we're in a country that deals with holidays very badly, right? I'm old enough to remember when we celebrated both Abraham Lincoln's birthday and George Washington's birthday. Most kids, if you ask them today, have no idea when George Washington or Abraham Lincoln were actually born. Every year we celebrate Labor Day, but we spend no time talking about the history of labor in this country, right? So on the one hand, it's like, yeah, it's nice to have a holiday, but if we're not going to do it right, then why do it at all?
Thank you. Wanted to take one more question here, and I would love to hear from both of you how your curriculum is changing in terms of as various events are shaping? What do you expect in terms of the classroom this fall? Obviously, it's a very different paradigm, but in terms of, how that's going to work for both of you guys.
So I'm the chair of a Black Studies department at a top tier university. And when I start hearing national conversations about we need to create anti-racist curriculum, and I'm like, hello, what do you think we've been doing as a field for 50 years? And which nobody paid any attention to. And in far too many of these institutions, including at times Duke, when these issues occur, they don't even look at the expertise that they have on their own faculty around these issues. So, to the extent that it will make important interventions in other fields for which those interventions need to be made, I can't say that I'm going to do anything fundamentally different than the kind of work that I've been doing, at least in my career, for the last 25 years.
And then I actually am going to be at the National Humanities Center working on my book. So in some ways I'm excited about the book. I'm relieved to not have to face fall teaching because I think it's going to be hard. I feel bad for my colleague Thavolia Glimp because as the other person who teaches African American history, like all of the students of African American history have her class to look to because they're going to be down to. When I go back and have to rethink, I tend to give classes big titles so I can put whatever I want to in them. So I teach a first year seminar called Black Lives. And that is going to actually, I'd already had Elizabeth Alexander's The Light of the World in there, but I'm going to have more books that really think about how we think about life itself, which in some ways, what are Black artists and writers ever doing, right? But for the first years, especially more expressly to come at that question. But I also teach a US history and fiction and fact, which doesn't announce itself as a Black people course, which means it gets a very different student enrollment. And that's the class where I had this Idea Hartman assignment. And I had this wonderful student come up to me at the end of the semester and he was like, so professor, when I signed up for this class, I had no idea there was going to be so much like Black people and Latino and Native American stuff. And I wouldn't have taken it if I'd known. But I'm really glad I took it. And so I think that some of that, not just speaking to the people who already know they want to know, but making sure that my students in my general survey class understand that they don't know the history of this country if they don't know the history of the peoples who have lived and worked in it, right? I'm always doing that, but I need to be more deliberate and thoughtful about how I do that.
Professor Neal, Professor Lentz-Smith, thank you so much for this insightful and powerful discussion. I'd now like to turn it over to Sanders Adu, our other co-chair for DBA.
Thanks.
So guys, thank you very, very much for joining this lecture series. Thank you, Professor Neal and Professor Lentz-Smith, and Harry did a wonderful job moderating. Thanks to Dina. This is the first in a series of lectures that Duke Black Alumni and Duke Alumni Association are going to be doing together, along with the Department of African American Studies. We will be having a lecture next Thursday, July 9th, with Professor Sandy Darity on racial and ethnic economic disparities. On July 14th, Professor Darity will join us again on economic reparations. And on July 16th, our very own Mark Anthony Neal and Carla Holloway will have a very interesting lecture on the color codes, when and where they matter. We'll also be having some surprise guests later in the summer, so please tune in. And again, thank you very much for joining us. And one last thing, if you have questions that you didn't get answered, please send us an email to Duke Black Alumni, all one word, @duke.edu, and check your mailbox for future lecture series registrations. Thank you very much.